Hello, everyone. Welcome to Anthrolore, the catalogs and archives of myths, legends, and folklore. And today we have some uh, faculty members from Coconino Community College here to talk about some Native American heritage and aspects and things like that. Want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Brian Francis. I'm Program Manager Senior of Academic Advising and Career Development.
Hi, I'm Frenchelle Tahani. I'm the Student Engagement Specialist here in the Student Affairs Department at CCC.
Thank you both so much for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Well, we were hoping that you could help our listeners better understand the Native experience in higher ed and any of the experiences and stories that you'd like to share just to honor the diversity that we have in this beautiful area of the world. Whoever wants to go.
There's never a set order.
No.
It's just fair game.
Yeah. I think some of the things, November is, Native American Heritage Month. And I always want to point out that, every day we should kind of think about Indigenous peoples and Native people, no matter what day or what month it is. And I think one of the things here at Coconino Community College, and in any other college I've worked with, I worked at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. In my experience with student affairs and student services, in higher education, I think there's always two sides to like celebrating Native American heritage. Of course, there's the culture, hence my title, Beyond Feathers and Fry Bread, serving Native students in higher education. So there's the cultural aspects of it that you can celebrate. There's certainly the dances, there's certainly the food and the culture and everything else. And I think in higher education and anywhere, that's become a place where everybody feels comfortable. They want to celebrate that. They want to have that. But I think we have to look beyond that when we serve Native American students in higher education. There's a lot of experience on the reservation where people, as far as the struggles on the reservation, the lack of jobs, certainly, there's a lot of other issues also in different parts. And but also students that are bringing a lot of that when you go deeper into that, the historical trauma of Native American people and some of the things that they have been through over the centuries. And, because of, colonization. And so, and of course, when you're coming from the schools and everything else in your school is really about a culture and a history that's not really a part of yours, that you may not totally understand, you're kind of colonized in your mind to think that these are the people, this is your history, these past presidents are your presidents. And so I think what happens naturally when students do come to college is that they go through this sense of awareness. And they get to a certain level, they may take a class in anthropology, sociology, or American Indigenous Studies, American Indian Studies, and they're like, whoa, this is not what I was taught, and so then they start to question. And it's good to question those things. And then when you start to question, say, okay, what's going on? What are we doing in this community, in this college, to truly support Native students in the sense of who we hire on this campus? Do we mirror the community as far as the community of Flagstaff? Do we mirror the students that we are serving in our staff, our faculty? And also, are we also looking at programs to support these students? And so I think those are some of the things when it goes beyond just the culture of how do we celebrate that and how do we support that. And that's something I'm always looking at when I work on a college campus and start to see those things. What can we do to bring on a Native American recruitment and retention specialist to help with those things? Because, applying for tribal scholarships can be, quite daunting at times. How do we have somebody to help with that? And based on the statistics here, most of our Native students are first generation. They're the first in their family to go to college. And mom and dad may not totally know everything about how to apply for financial aid, let alone applying for schools and scholarships. How do we support that? And I think when we talk about extended families or talk about Native families and Hispanic families, there's really an extended family model. So it almost involves everybody. What can we do to provide a Native American like family and student orientation at the beginning of the year to involve family, because those kids, those brothers and cousins, and they're on a college campus. How can we kind of talk to them about being in college? Because when you're back home, it's not necessarily like you see yourself in college just yet. How do we get them here to do that? How do we provide that? So I think there's a lot of different opportunities for us to do those things besides celebrating the food and the culture. What else can we do with that? So I'm always looking at those things. And so it's always, back in the student affairs area, we do our best to mirror our students, our population of students. I think we have a pretty diverse group back there with different ideas and different backgrounds that provide to the discussion. And so I appreciate that, and especially our student workers. Neilani's one of our workers at the front desk, and then Fran used to be a worker. She's a former alum, and we hired her as our student engagement specialist, so she kind of sees that. So we want to, provide that and also get feedback from our students. What is their experience here? What can we do to make it better?
Awesome.
I think I can give like a student perspective as a Native American student. Well, my family has an educated background, so I already know like pretty much the system of how college works and stuff. But as a student engagement specialist, I always encounter the Native American students, especially the first gen students, and it's kind of interesting because they don't really have much like resources, or they didn't know that they have that much resources here in college. So as a Native American student helping another Native American student, it's very rewarding, and I always try to give them every resource I can possible to them that would help them succeed in higher education. Yeah.
Well, I think something that we're all, from the anthropological perspective, very passionate about is the decolonization of the education system, decolonizing our minds, decolonizing our language and our tongues. What are some ways that you kind of see us being able to maneuver that, to work it in a direction that we can positively move forward in the classrooms or in our college setting? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I think one of the things, we have a common reads program, and I know they're doing their best to bring in, some different pieces of literature. If we brought in a book written by a Native scholar about some of the things, that not only applies to Native students, but also non-Native as well. It's a good way to have a discussion in the classroom about some of those things. And I think that's one of the things that we can do is look at our curriculum. And then certainly there's courses like in American Indian Studies, Applied Indigenous Studies, I think over at NAU. I think those are really good programs. Also courses to possibly try to let's bring one course here and see what we can do and provide that in our general education piece, and a course that pretty much anyone can take. I think those are different pieces. I think when you open that up, you can provide a bunch of also careers and employment opportunities within that discussion to say, oh yeah, a lot of our students, I hear this all the time, you guys probably hear it as well, just, I want to go back to the reservation to help my people, and it's cool to really hear that, but what does that mean exactly, and I don't know if we've really quite figured that out to help a student. Certainly somebody with that background can do that, but have we really looked at what that means? And with the lack of jobs on the reservation and then all these other things, what does that really mean? And I think some of the things when you can do that is then you can learn to decolonize in a sense, the mind, and be like, okay, that's what is possible, but also then bringing in that discussion and those different ideas is really good in higher ed, and having those discussions. And then also I think bringing in speakers that do want to speak to some of the issues. Let's talk about the snowball, let's talk about some of those things. It was interesting because, we had Red Milla Cody 3-4 years ago. The Indigenous Student Association brought her in, and it was right before, it was right at this time for Native American Heritage Month. And she gave some of her songs, but within it, she also talked a lot about the issues of Native American people. And she really brought it to point. She talked about Thanksgiving. We're getting ready to call it to celebrate Thanksgiving, but really, she's like, I call it Thanks-taking, because if you look at the history of what happened with Native peoples within that history, I think you have to think about it. It's not something to. It wasn't like a really beautiful dinner where people got together. There's a lot of things that went on, genocide and cultural genocide that we're still suffering from. So let's have that discussion as well. And the comments that I got from faculty and staff, was that, it was good. We appreciated the music, but it was a little bit, hard to hear about it. And it's like, well, that's got to be the piece we have to talk about as well. And we always get a lot of good feedback when we have our dances and our fry bread, but when it comes to having a hard discussion about what the true history is, it's really interesting.
It's very hard to explain in English too, because the Navajo language, I think any language, Native American language, is very descriptive. And like our origin stories, it could take like a whole lifetime, and it's not even the whole entire origin stories that you've heard throughout your lifetime. So it's really interesting.
That's a comment I get on the Peoples of the Southwest course that I teach too. It's like, oh, great course, I learned a lot, but we need to focus more on the positive things. It's like, well, we also need to learn about what's impacting people today.
You can't just look at all the pretty lights and pretty stuff.
Exactly.
You have to understand where all of that went and why we're only learning about it in a specialized course.
Right.
And why this isn't just part of everything, because the decolonization of the mind is a very hard thing for most people to get to, because a lot of the time people take an anthropology course just because it's a humanities credit and they have to take it. They don't really pay attention. They're just there for it. And I experienced that a lot when I was just starting off in college. I didn't really care about what I was taking. I was just trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And then I sat down, focused in a cultural anthropology course, and it's just sort of that like flicking the switch where it's like, oh, yeah, there's a lot of stuff I don't know about that all of my history courses have sort of glazed over and everything. The history is a lot darker than we all want to admit it is, and we need to shine a light on it. We can't just sweep it under the rug forever.
We need to be willing to be made uncomfortable. And I think that's why stories are so important, because it's not just the Disney retelling. It is about the discomfort that we feel, whether it is the original Grimm's tales or whether it's an origin story. It's all about the real meat of the experience, and that feeds into our identity in relation to these stories. So that's part of the power there.
I think that darker side too, like it shows you like how much progress you've made too, and also how much progress you need to make as well. And so ignoring that is like ignoring the things that you need to do.
And I think we see it every day, right? Whether it's in television, media, it's like the romanticizing of Native peoples and Native culture that stands out the most. And so that picture's always going through everybody's mind, So it is comfortable to keep it there because nobody has actually challenged it in some ways. And so it's really interesting to see that. So when there are young people here at the college, it's always kind of good to see them kind of progress. And then I think that's a challenge for us because we only see them for 2 years and then they move on, right? Then they take those courses at a university that are a little bit more challenging, and so they start to question more. And so then they start to say, okay, why do we have this? Why can't we have that there and talk to the president? Let's talk to people, And the students have, they don't realize it at times, but they can change on this campus whatever they want. At Fort Lewis College, where I used to work, as part of as an advisor to a student club called the Patriot Tipi Society, and they, they would have ceremonies during this time for the school itself, and over the years, they managed to get a teepee ground built on campus by the student services area. They also have now a sweat lodge that's on campus, and then so they're if anything they're also spoken to when different changes happen. So the student also takes that on. It's the first place I've seen Native American president as part of the Associated Student Body president there. So they've always been very active politically on campus. I think it's just because of definitely the high number of Native students there that are coming from everywhere. But I've seen it happen with a lot of power to talk about those things. So.
I think it's a big difference too when you have the 4-year experience, because
Yes.
there's more time to grow, to become accustomed to it, and then to challenge those norms. Whereas here, so many of our students, as you mentioned, being first generation, we're learning the environment, we're learning the norms,
Yes.
and you can't change the norms until you learn them first.
That's so
Yeah,
true.
that's a challenge.
Speaking from like a West Coast perspective, I'm from the Bay Area, so it's a very colonized, very white area for the most part. I just trying to grasp moving from a predominantly white area to somewhere that is more diverse and more just generally more less white, to say, has been one of the more interesting experiences in my life, because it's so interesting to start to learn about the culture and heritage of the land, when in California all I learned about was the Bear Flag Revolt and the Gold Rush. To see how connected the history of the land is here, specifically, especially with Lisa's courses and the courses I've taken at NAU, that combined the history of the land with everything else we're learning, has been very different for coming from some place that's considered more progressive as California, where the only tribe I've ever interacted with was the Ohlone tribe, who came to bless our campus once a year, and that was all the interaction we really had. I don't even know where the reservation would technically be in that area, or if there even is one nearby, because California is so populated and so just really just been taken over by different groups over and over again. I don't even know where to start.
Well,
to
there are
look.
so many tribes who still aren't recognized in California and
Exactly.
completely lost their land and their status. And that's right.
And it's so much. It's been a very eye-opening experience that makes me want to go back and try and make a difference there, because if we aren't learning about it there, if we're not talking about it there, what is it ever going to change?
Well, one of the things that we were going to ask you too is, in light, and you mentioned it, in light of Thanksgiving coming up too, what message would you like most people to be aware of with regards to Thanksgiving and to this American myth versus the reality of the experience? For example, we talked previously about how I have a number of students who, when we talk about Thanksgiving, that it's actually a period of mourning in their families, not necessarily of feasting. And so, is there anything that you'd like to share from your own personal experiences or from that viewpoint?
Not really. I mean, we celebrate Thanksgiving because it involves food.
And food is good. Absolutely.
Food is good, yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, for Thanksgiving, I know in my household, my dad is very, kind of standoffish against the westernized holidays, cultures. Not holiday cultures. There's a saying custard spit. Just things like that, and we don't necessarily have a gathering and just come together and pray about prosperity. It's really much
Yeah, I think one of the biggest messages for me is you take the whole calendar year that we celebrate any holiday, right? And really, it goes back to indigenous calendar. You go back to Europe and you look at the times that they celebrated things. Same thing. When you worship the earth and the sky and the universe and you observe it every single day, if you're not watching TV or you're on your phone, you have nothing else that's artificial, then everything else is natural. You'll know when the sun's going to come up. And you know when the sun's going to go down. You'll automatically know in the wintertime, oh man, the sun is really low in the south, you know. Well, when does that happen? Okay, when should we start preparing? So really, you know, that's the winter solstice, right? And I think preparing for the winter solstice is that big thing. How do we get through that? Because it is a time where it's mainly dark, and that can mess with you mentally. And then being cold and all that. Just imagine what it's like when you didn't really have anything. You had older folks, you know, especially I see old people today, and they start freaking out when it gets colder. You know, it's like, oh man, you know, back in the day, that probably meant, okay, what's going to happen to me this winter, you know?
Feel it in my joints.
And we feel it somewhere else
I
pretty
can
soon.
feel it, you know. And I think, you know, in the fall, you know, people anywhere would get ready for the fall. The fall feast, you bring in all your, whatever you grew over the spring and in the summer, you bring it together. Grow as much as you can, because you're not growing just for you, you're growing for your extended family and the community. So you bring in the squash, you bring in all that corn. Okay, what can we do? Well, let's celebrate, you know, and let's celebrate the fall, but let's eat this food and now start preparing, you know, start preparing. And so then what can we do with this corn to keep it longer? Well, let's dry it out and get it ready. You know, same thing with the squash and other things, and start storing it for the winter so we can have that. And so that's really what it is a fall feast, you know, and that's what, when people come together. So I always imagine, you know, the pilgrims, they arrive just when we're getting ready to eat, and they're like, oh man, hey, you guys look like you're starving. Why don't you sit down and have some food, you know? And that's just our custom too, you know, to have people and invite them in. And so I think that's the big message, is like, it's a fall feast. It's good to celebrate it, but always remember, you know, that's what you're preparing for. And as you go into Christmas, know that you're celebrating the winter solstice. But over the years, they've put the birth of Jesus Christ on December 25th. But it's really December 21st, 22nd, depending on the year, when the sun starts to set down a little bit earlier and pass through the south and start coming down. Longest days, longest nights of the year, and then from there it starts to come back after the 21st, 22nd. Each and every second starts to get a little bit longer into, of course, Easter, and so that's when it changes again. So that's when you celebrate, you know, the spring equinox, when things start to get longer. So, of course, there's a whole idea of rabbits and some other things within that. Being happy and healthy and running around. So then, you know, there's a rebirth again. So there was a celebration of the equinox, but today we celebrate that as Easter. So when you look at the calendar and how everything rolls, it's really from, indigenous to the Americas, but I also want to take it a step further and look at Europeans, because they celebrated that. You know, the Germans, they used to celebrate the actual Christmas tree, where they would go out and find a live tree,
Yule tree.
and they used to put apples and different things on there to celebrate. We want to make sure we make it into the spring to have a good bountiful spring, and so they would make those offerings, you know. So I really think as people on this earth, we need to remember that, you know, that we all share that in common as well, whether it's the fire, whether it's water, all those things we can relate to. It's amazing when you can bring a group of people from all different parts of the world, take them camping or backpacking for several days, and you sit around a fire without phones. The stories that can come out of there, the community that can come out of there. And, you know, but today we're so disconnected by technology and other things. And if we did that, I think you'd see that a little bit more. So I think it's always remembering that piece as people start to get into the holidays and throughout the years, that, you know, take some time to turn off that TV, get up early, see where the sun is coming from, and going out for hikes and doing those things. You get to see what kind of plants and animals are out there during certain times of the year. So I think that's all just a natural thing for people to do. So, yeah.
we have so much more in common than we have differences, and we forget that.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's one of the big points of this whole podcast, is to not just look at the cool, neat things that other cultures have, although that is one of the more fun parts, but the sort of how we all sort of tell the same stories together. Like, I think the last time we were all here, we talked about vampires and how every culture has some interpretation of that, and that's almost a universal thing throughout culture. You can pick a piece out and say, well, where does this fit in somewhere else? And I've always liked that, especially the storytelling. We have been very passionate about storytelling for a while now. That the whole sitting around the campfire just to unwind after a long day and retell stories, tell new stories. The aspect of just creativity in life as a whole, basically. We really don't have that much anymore.
No, we don't. Yeah, I used to work at Durango, Colorado at Fort Lewis College, and I was overseeing a program called Upward Bound to prepare students for college. And so we used to do a lot of outdoor activities in the summer. It was during the bridge program. These were high school students, so we would actually, I saw it happen, before my eyes. We'd take them backpacking and have this diverse group of kids sitting around a campfire and just talking about things. And they had one MSR fuel stove, and they had to make their own food. So I had like groups of 4 or 5 in each group, and so they had to get together and decide how they're going to cook and put that together. And it was cool to see all that happen, and we took away their cell phones. They weren't necessarily upset about it, but I was surprised. That's where the most upset.
Yeah, that's always the thing. The kids don't care as much once they're out. The parents are like, oh, why can't I get in contact with them?
It's so interesting to me. I was like, wow, yeah. So I think, that just seeing that happen, we would give them just like a liter of water each. And so it's like, well, you're not going to use that water to bathe every day. We're all in the same boat. We're all going to stink the same. And you're going to use that to drink and, take care of, and then you're going to purify it, of course, through some of the rivers and streams in Durango. But they learned about conserving, right? Being cognizant of how much water they're using, and knowing that, all these other things play into the environment. And it's when you have just a little bit of water just for everybody, it's not easy, When you can just turn on the tap water, it's, you're so desensitized from the fact of where it comes from and how little we do have. And so, I think those are things that is good for everybody. And, forgot to introduce myself, but I'm of the Coyote Pass clan, that's my mother's side. Sitna Jenny is my father's side. Kia'ani's my grandfathers, and my paternal grandfathers are the one who walks around clans. So those are my 4 clans, and that was something we also talked a lot about. We took students to Ellis Island in New York City, and it was cool to see our students that were not native to look at the roles that were coming through, and they were looking for their last name. I was like, and they were like, oh God, it looks like my family came from Italy, or they came from, Ireland, and things like that they saw. And I was like, yes, we introduce ourselves as clans, and that's basically what it is, I'm part Irish, I'm part this, my mom's from here, and this and that. It just tells, don't forget your foundation, who you are and where you come from, because it has a lot of rich history, and European history is the same. And I think that's good. Did you introduce yourself?
No.
Fran is my sister by clan too, so.
So we get to tease each
So
other.
I pick on her all the time.
Really? My clans is I'm Bitterwater, Todich Eatney, Michelin, Klesislanim, Beshishtin, which is mini goats, Ashinhan Deshache, Salt Clan, and Todich Eatney Deshanella, Bitterwater. Yeah.
This has been really informative and very it solidified everything you've taught me, basically.
You did a good job.
Yeah.
Awesome.
There's no doubting Lisa's a good teacher. I just wish I had more teachers like her earlier on.
Yeah, anthropology is a cool subject. I think that was one of the first times we really started to talk about Native issues in regards to NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. And really that's when they started to look at the repatriation of different things back to the tribes. And we talked about the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. We talked about the Long Walk. We talked about so many different things and how tribes were coming together and doing that. So you see this cool movement like in the 1990s to really tribes are starting to take over and to talk about some of that power that it can raise in decolonization. And I think it's cool to see that through that. But then also anthropologists doing the same thing to accept also the oral traditions, right, and listening to those things. So there's that reverse anthropology that I also appreciate about anthropology. I think it's good. So.
Yeah, we talk about that. I think the best example is the recent discovery, I'll put that in quotes, of how birds in Australia will light fires in the fields to bring the bugs up. And the Aboriginal communities have been saying this for hundreds of years, and it's only recently that scientists have observed it, so it's true, finally. But it's like if we just listen to each other's stories, learn about each other's experiences, our histories, the truths that we know, there's so much there. And yet so frequently Western culture and society kind of poo-poos that previous experience. Oh, it's an oral history, as if that's somehow less important than the written word. And that's part two of what we also want to break through in terms of decolonization.
Totally. I think that's always like a struggle too, like when it comes to Native American professionals. A lot of the way we think and information we provide is seen as anecdotal as opposed to like true data, right? So there's a difference there. And I think there's got to be an appreciation for both. So I think that's always some of the things we struggle with as well. So.
Yeah, and when science does try and prove those stories to be true, we see like two extremes of it. We see the monster hunters, the cryptozoologists who want the pure, it has to be out there. And then you see the other side of it where it's like, oh no, this can't be true. There's no science to support this, even though people have been telling a story about it for tens of thousands of years. And I think that's an important thing to look at as like a folklorist, as a cultural anthropologist, is you don't look at these stories as just stories. When you're in that culture, those stories are more than just a story. They're the truth to those people, and you need to accept that as truth to yourself when you're looking at it. You don't have to prove that it's true. You don't have to prove that it's fake. It's just a universal constant. And I think that's something that people just need to take a step back and look at it through that lens more, as opposed to we have to prove it's true or we have to prove it's false. We've sort of lost that connection with storytelling, I feel, where it's either just for fun or it's fact.
I think like that's kind of why I don't really like science sometimes, is that it tries to make everything universal, where it's like the past of people, it's seen through their experience, and that's how they explain things, whereas like working now, it's kind of like reclaim your past but also having it work in the world that we're in now. So it's kind of like things do change, yes, but science doesn't account for that.
Right. And we forget how we're a bit biased anyway.
Yeah.
And then when we really look at the scientific method, I mean, the way that we tend to look at the past and indigenous peoples is so shaded by this value of science as being something only recently part of an experience, when we've always looked at the things around us in nature from a scientific perspective. Well, what's going to happen if I boil this herb? And this is how we've come to the knowledge that we have today. And like in class, we talk about how it's so egotistical of us to think that we only now have all the answers and this is exactly how it is, whereas peoples around the world have been looking throughout human history, and we have to respect that because it's all been a path that's been on that same scientific method.
We just gave alchemy a new name. It's called chemistry now. Magic is physics, basically, at this point. Every time somebody tries to explain something to me about a black hole, I'm like, that's magic. I don't understand. I think, I can't remember who said it, but somebody a while ago told me that magic is just unexplained science. And that's sort of how I've been trying to look at it, because I don't need to explain everything in the world. Yeah. If you went back in time and you tried to explain how a phone, this little cube or this little flat rectangle is projecting pictures and moving pictures, that's magic to them.
No.
But
Wait.
Yeah. But it doesn't, we don't have to explain everything in the world, and we've tried our best to do that, and we've, in a sense, sucked all the joy and magic out of everything.
Yeah.
You don't hear you hear noises at night and think, oh, what sort of monster is doing that? You think, oh, it's a raccoon or something. Well, we do, obviously. But
so I live in a household, or I lived in 2 households where we use the word magic and we've used the word science somewhat interchangeably. My mom wasn't so supportive of this because she's a nurse and she's like, science is science, magic is magic. But, you had, witches in Europe concocting these potions that would make people better or that would kill people, and it was called magic. And we look at it today and all they're doing is mixing a bunch of herbs and cooking it and then serving it to you in a delicious meal or in this something that might be good for you, and then you die. So magic and science I use interchangeably. Not in public sometimes though, because then people look at me like I expect fairies to fly out of nowhere. But
And I think that's like an important thing too, because they're not that different. Mm-hmm. It's just, science is just really explained. We've tried to strip away everything and explain every single aspect of life, and as a result, we've lost the ability to see the world around us as anything other than science, I feel. And it's just not as fun anymore.
And I think that it really does kill the beauty that's inherent in the Indigenous perspectives too, because, for example, the Diné origin story, which I know this isn't the time to talk about it, but it is on the landscape and it's visible. When you're driving through the reservation, you can see it enacted. And that's powerful, to be surrounded by that, to be immersed within your own cultural identity and origins. That's powerful. And that is something that is removed in the way that so many of these oral traditions are denied validity, and retelling.
I think there's that whole new concept of the anthropology of landscape, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, my wife is originally from France, and she wrote a PhD on the difference between like preservation in regards to Europe. During the Middle Ages, the whole idea of preservation was around the king and the king's land. So then you had the king's elk, the king's deer, the king's hunting area, and the peasants weren't allowed to hunt in those areas. And so they were trying to preserve it, and that in their mind they were thinking that. And so their whole idea of nature in itself was preserving it like that, keeping other humans out of it. And so the whole idea of preservation then carried across here in the form of national parks. So what happened naturally was they started to move indigenous people from the Grand Canyon, from these places, to have it just that, what they perceive as nature. So it's interesting, they would ask folks, what is your idea of nature? It's like, people would describe, it's the San Francisco peaks with aspen and elk and all this and that. That's to me. And but when you ask indigenous people, there's really no concept of that, because the whole landscape tells the story of who you are and where you come from. So, you go to the Tetons, you ask the tribes there. The Tetons itself, represents the earth's breast and the nipples and how it provided and nurtured the family. So if you ever go there, there's so many animals there. So when the first French explorers came in, so they called them the Tetons because you have these indigenous people refer it's like that's a place, that provided those things. So the earth is a part of your body as well. You go to the canyon here, you go to different parts of the Southwest, you see sandstone with swirls in it, and the old people, they say there's places where the earth breathes and gives you life, and those are the places, just like the swirls on your fingertips, and then the swirls on the top of your head, that's where your body breathes, And so when you look at that, geology-wise, that's a lot of sand, a lot of wind that made those things. And so that's where the earth breathes in these special places. So when you look at the landscape, you're seeing that who you are, where you come from. And I think that's the biggest difference. You don't see yourself as separate. You don't see yourself as a threat to it. I think that's the thing. How do we get back to that where we don't see ourselves as a threat to it? And I think that's interesting. That's what she wrote about. So it was a really interesting kind of looking at those things.
And that's absolutely something that in Western culture has been lost in coming over here, because we don't have that direct relationship to the landscape. We don't see ourselves in it. And we've been so nomadic throughout various countries over so many years that we've lost that. The value is only in who owns it, or who controls it, who fenced it off, rather than seeing ourselves as part of that. And I mean, we see evidence of that in the origin stories as well, right? Are we created to dominate, or are we created as part of it, as protectors, right? So it's so many subtle ways that we see culturally that we separate ourselves.
I think that's a pretty good spot to end it on.
Okay.
That was we went a lot of different places towards the end. But I think that was pretty informative, because we are about at 45 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you.
That's
Time-
went fast.
Yeah,
Yes.
time flies when you have when you're passionate what you talk about. And I wish we had more people who were passionate about what they talked about. But this has been a very eye-opening experience, and I'm glad we could have you guys here.
Yeah, that was fun.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.